Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Mess. So, taking out a fun and interesting video concept for you guys tonight because we're going to be talking all about physical media and how it feels like physical games are dying, at least the type of games that you actually own that you can actually put in your system and play without having any sort of online connection, because there's been a big sea change in gaming in like the last 12 to 18 months. I've talked about it briefly on my channel with the Nintendo Game Key cards. We're going to be getting into that today. And before you go down below and yell clickbait, I'm sure you're going to do it anyway. You can have an opinion, I can have an opinion. I'm not here to fearmonger. I'm here to talk about, from a collector's perspective, just how much of a bummer modern gaming has been. Because if you know me and you know the channel, you know I love my physical collections. I love my arcade boards. I love my cartridges. I love everything else. But honestly, kind of starting with Switch 2 with a little bit of Xbox mixed in, lately we've been getting a lot of different games that don't actually exist on the game cartridge. Sure, something like Mario Kart World is actually on the cartridge that Nintendo sells to you when you buy it, but so many of the Switch 2 games, including games that would fit underneath the 64GB card limit, are just being sold as game key cards. That does not have any game on the cartridge whatsoever. It's basically a small chip that's just going to hold a key code so you can download the game once you actually put that card in. And that is just absolutely something that in and of itself isn't actually a physical game. It is a product that you can hold in your hand, but there is no game contained within. And even something honestly like Mario Kart World, for having something like the actual data on the cartridge, it is just not the most fun thing in the world to put on your shelf, because when you open up the case, it is absolutely empty in its entirety. And it really kind of begs the question, and I know this is very forward thinking, what happens in 20 to 30 years when these servers are dead? Is there going to be games that you can download with these game key cards in 15-20 years when Nintendo might be on Switch 5 at that point in time? And it's one of those things, sure, it is future looking, and I'm going to mangle the quote, but there is a quote out there that wise men plant trees whose shade they will never sit under because they will be too old to actually enjoy it. So it's one of those things, we have to actually think about the far future, because these game key cards right now, you can sell them, you can trade them, you can download the titles, but what happens in 2050 when the servers go offline? Do they still exist? And that's what I mean about physical games and actually having the physical files, and how that seems to be dying, so much so that apparently there's been some surveys in Japan, because game buyers there have been gravitating away from these game key cards. People don't feel like they're actually getting a physical game when they buy a game key card, and even on some of the Xbox discs, there really isn't any game on the disc. It is all on the server. Compared to something like a Neo Geo AES game, a physical, tangible product that you can hold in your hand, the game is on that cartridge, the game will always be on that cartridge, the servers can't shut down and remove the game from the cartridge. It just exists as a physical game, versus what they've been selling lately, which is just basically a key that accesses a game. It's kind of like if you had the key to my house. That does not mean you own the house. You can get the contents anytime you want. If I move, then basically that house doesn't exist. If the server shut down one day, then those games might not exist. And again, even with the actual physical games you get from Nintendo, the overall joy of actually quote-unquote collecting now is kind of dead. But honestly, it's getting completely ridiculous. This Gaia 7 Complete Edition here, it's selling for $100. They spent the time to make this fan kind of fun. They spent the time to make this Lucky Cat, give you an awesome box, but what could they not do? They couldn't put the damn game on a card. They had to sell you a $100 key card with some tchotchkes along for the ride. And that's the thing, you're not actually buying Disgaea 7. You don't own the game, you own some accessories with a license to download it somewhere. And I'm sure there probably isn't even a manual in that case, because those are dead and gone these days. And that is one of the things. I understand the younger generation isn't understanding of how game collecting actually works, and that's what the developers and the publishers out there really want. They want to get everyone used to a reality in which you don't actually buy games, you just buy a license and download them. But we've seen some reports of Switch 2s being banned. Of course, on the MIG side of things, that makes perfect sense. They should not be using these things on a Switch 2. Nintendo is going to catch it. But there have been more isolated reports out there, unconfirmed, of Switch 2s being banned just because somebody bought used games that had been dumped. So what happens to that game key card collection when your system gets banned completely? Well, you can't put any more game key cards in there because you can't get the downloads. You're going to have to go out and buy a brand new Switch 2 if you want to play. Let's look at another example of a game that is on a disc, but at this point in time, the game on the disc is not the actual game in and of itself. This is an original launch day copy of Cyberpunk 2077 that my wife bought me right around my birthday, and there is a game on this disc, but with a massive amount of updates because this thing shipped very broken. What's on the actual disc in and of itself isn't anywhere near what Cyberpunk 2077 is now, and I totally get games update, that's perfectly fine. I'm not saying they have to reissue new discs. I'm trying to talk about this as a concept. What happens maybe 35-40 years from now when Microsoft maybe abandons the Xbox concept completely? Are you still going to be able to hook up an Xbox Series X to the network and find some sort of server populated by Microsoft that's going to allow you to update all of the different files you need to play the most recent version of Cyberpunk 2077? If those files no longer exist, sure, you own the game on a disc, but you own a version of it that is so inherently bad compared to what they actually patched up that it kind of feels like you own a beta of a product that you can't actually get the full retail version of. But at least you do get some fun accessories. Or think of something like Concord, a game that was just basically killed and no longer exists. Now Sony did refund everyone who wanted a refund, including the physical owners of these discs, but it is again a situation in which companies can just take things offline whenever they want, and it basically doesn't exist anymore. And that's for a multiplayer thing, something like Concord, it does make kind of sense. Once the game isn't supported anymore, they usually take the servers offline, and if the game is super popular, people set up their own custom servers. With something like Concord, you owned a physical game, but now that game no longer exists, you can't get into it, and therefore the game is no longer actually a game in and of itself. It almost gets meta in some ways, and it is a fun thought experiment to think about what a physical game truly means. Because of course with modern games and updates, the game that came on the disc is almost always not the same game that exists on the server. And of course with Concord being shut down, that physical game is just basically a coaster at this point in time. It goes nowhere, and that's kind of the question about how games are going to work in general. Versus something like Ridge Racer 5 on PlayStation 2, there aren't any updates whatsoever. The content is on the disc, it is locked off, and there is a game on there. But of course I totally understand something like Ridge Racer 5 probably could have used a few updates because it was one of the launch window games, and there definitely are a few flaws in the game in my opinion. I am not at all opposed to downloading games, I'm not opposed to having updates actually happen, but it is the reality that with game key cards, with games like The Crew being taken offline, the idea of physically owning games and actually owning the game, not just a license to it, is something that developers and publishers don't want you to have anymore. The idea of collecting games and being able to play them whenever you want in perpetuity is a concept that game developers can't monetize a second time. So that's why you see a lot of new games, and on the Xbox side, some games shipping on discs that don't really have any game whatsoever, versus something like Bomberman Hero here on the Nintendo 64. It's a game from 50 years from now, so long as I can find an N64 that works, I can play it, no questions asked. And that really is the entire case at hand here. In 40 years, when I'm 80 years old, I can sit down, and as long as I can find a Nintendo 64 that actually still works, and so long as TVs have some sort of input that I can plug the original hardware into, I'll be able to play Bomberman Hero just like I did when it first came out back in the 90s. And do you think that's going to be the same situation for something like an Xbox Series X game that doesn't actually have the game on the disc, or Nintendo game key cards? I'm not talking about tomorrow, I'm not talking about next month, next year, or even next decade. I'm talking about in 40 years from now. Are those servers going to be live? Or are you buying licensed key cards that are basically just going to be taken away from you at a certain point in time? Because there's definitely something to be said about a physical game in your hand that actually contains the game specified. This is Echoes of the Unread, a prototype press kit that I just received that I'll be doing a video on shortly, but actually holding that and knowing that the game is there, that is why people like physical games, or something like Bubble Symphony here. The only way that you can get a physical copy of this game outside of a compilation is the original Sega Saturn disc from Japan. Now this isn't going to get unlicensed, it's not going to stop working unless I accidentally break it or disc rot happens, or even something like Killing Time Resurrected. This is the first and only game I've ever had my name in as far as the credits are concerned, and Limited Run Games did print a copy, and I was sent one from the developers for helping out ever so slightly, and trust me, it was a very small amount of help. But this means that I can play this game when I want to, so long as the game is on the disc, and it is one of those things I did check, the game contents are there. And that is what what matters to me as far as game collecting and just owning games is concerned. I just want to know that in 20 years, if I put that disc in my PlayStation 5, I'm going to be able to play the game. If I put my disc in the Xbox Series X, I'm going to be able to play it. Same exact thing with Nintendo Switch too, but honestly, I absolutely will not be buying any game key cards. I'm not giving somebody $60 to $80 of my money for something that doesn't exist outside of a license, especially for games that are below the 64 gigabyte cap, because I totally get it. Some games are larger than that, and they may actually need to use that online service to be able to exist on Switch too. But there's games out there that are 12, 14, 18, 20 gigabytes in data that are shipping on game key cards, and that's just so the developers can have more of the profits left for them, and you end up buying something that isn't anything more than a digital license on a fancy cartridge. But honestly, you leave me your comment down below. You tell me how you feel. And I totally get it. If you're in my age group, you probably love your physical media, your game collection, you want to own things. But people like my nephews that are in their early teens, their idea of games basically just exists as, hey, Dad, can I download this game on my Switch 2 so I can play it? And then they own it, even though the reality is they've just licensed it. It's going to be an interesting future. We'll have to see where it goes, but I'm a little bit bummed out. But I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.